They say every man has a breaking point, a line drawn in the dust that he swears he'll never cross. But out here in the unforgiving territories of the Wild West, where the sun bleaches bones white and the wind carries the whispers of dead men's last words, those lines have a way of disappearing like morning fog over the mesa. This is the story of a gunslinger who made a sacred oath, a promise so solemn that he carved it into his very soul, with the same intensity that a bullet carves through flesh. And for years, for long, agonizing years, he kept that oath, even when every fiber of his being screamed for vengeance, even when the world pushed him to the very edge of madness. But oaths, my friends, are like chains, and every chain has a breaking point. And when this man finally broke his, when he finally picked up that iron again and let it speak, the language of death, what happened next would echo through the canyons and valleys for generations to come, a tale so brutal, so unforgiving, so absolutely devastating that even the hardest men who heard it would fall silent and reach for their whiskey with trembling hands. The man's name was Elijah Stone, though most folks who knew him in those later years simply called him the Silent, and if you're thinking that's some kind of romantic nickname given to a mysterious drifter, you'd be dead wrong. Because Elijah earned that name through blood and horror, through a past so violent and so stained with death that when he finally hung up his guns, he didn't just stop shooting. He stopped talking about it, stopped thinking about it, stopped being the man he once was entirely. Before we get to the breaking of the oath, before we witness what happens when a dam of righteousness finally cracks and lets the flood of vengeance pour through, we need to understand who Elijah Stone was, because you can't truly appreciate the magnitude of a man's fall unless you first understand the height from which he plummeted. Elijah was born in 1847 in a small settlement along the Kansas-Missouri border, right in the heart of what would become some of the bloodiest territory in American history, and his childhood, if you could even call it that, was spent watching his father, a Union sympathizer, argue with neighbors who rode with Quantrill's raiders, watching tensions escalate from heated words to burned barns, to bodies hanging from trees. His father taught him to shoot when he was 7 years old, not because he wanted to raise a killer, but because in those times, in that place, a boy who couldn't defend himself was a boy marked for an early grave. By the time Elijah was 12, he could put 6 shots into a playing card at 30 paces, and by the time he was 14, he'd killed his first man, a bushwhacker who'd come to their farm looking to settle a score with his father, and Elijah remembered every detail of that moment. The way the man's eyes widened in surprise that a boy could draw so fast. The way his body crumpled like a puppet with cut strings. The way his mother screamed, and his father simply nodded and said, "You did what you had to do, son." That phrase, "you did what you had to do," became the justification for everything that followed. And what followed was a cascade of violence that would make lesser men vomit to recount. Because when the Civil War finally erupted in all its terrible glory, Elijah, at barely 15 years old, lied about his age and joined up with a Confederate guerrilla unit, not because he gave a damn about slavery or states' rights, but because the bushwhackers who'd been terrorizing his family rode with the Union irregulars, and revenge, that ancient and terrible motivator, had already sunk its hooks deep into his young heart. For 3 years, Elijah rode with men whose names would become synonymous with brutality. Men like Bloody Bill Anderson and Frank and Jesse James. And he learned from them the art of the ambush, the science of fear, the philosophy that says mercy is just weakness wearing a noble mask. They hit Union supply lines. They burned towns suspected of harboring Union sympathizers. They killed soldiers and civilians alike with an efficiency that was almost mechanical, and young Elijah with the quick draw and the dead eyes, became known as one of the most lethal members of the group. A boy who could ride into hell itself and come out the other side without a scratch. leaving behind him a trail of bodies that stretched from Missouri to Kansas and back again. But here's the thing about violence. Here's what they don't tell you when you're young and angry, and convinced that the gun in your hand is the solution to all the world's injustices. It doesn't just kill the people. You shoot, it kills something inside you too, piece by piece, shot by shot, until one day you look in the mirror and you don't recognize the thing staring back at you. The turning point came in 1864, during a raid on a small Kansas town called Baxter Springs. And if you know your history, you know that Baxter Springs was a massacre, pure and simple, a moment when the thin veneer of warfare stripped away, completely to reveal the raw, ugly face of murder. Elijah was there. He participated. He killed men who were trying to surrender. And in the chaos and the smoke and the screaming, he found himself in a general store, his gun pointed at a woman holding a child, a boy who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. And the woman was begging, pleading, saying the same words his own mother had said when bushwhackers came to their farm. And in that moment, in that crystalline, horrible moment, Elijah saw himself not as a soldier or a guerrilla fighter, or a man seeking justice, but as exactly what he was, a killer, a murderer, a monster wearing a human skin. He didn't pull the trigger that day. He lowered his gun and walked out of that store, mounted his horse, and rode away from the unit, away from the war, away from everything he'd known. And he rode until his horse collapsed from exhaustion, and he collapsed beside it. And when he woke up 3 days later in the care of a Quaker family who'd found him half dead from dehydration and fever, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. The Quakers, with their gentle ways and their absolute commitment to nonviolence, nursed him back to health without ever asking who he was or what he'd done, and their kindness, so foreign to him after years of blood and brutality, cracked something open inside him, some small seed of humanity that he'd thought was long dead. When he was well enough to leave, the patriarch of the family, a man named Jeremiah, with eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul, sat with him and asked him just one question: "What will you do now?" And Elijah, still weak, still haunted by the faces of all the men he'd killed and the woman and child he'd almost killed, said the only thing that made sense to him in that moment: "I'll never pick up a gun again." Jeremiah nodded slowly, and then he said something that Elijah would carry with him for the next 15 years. "An oath is a heavy thing, son, heavier than any iron you ever carried. And if you make this promise, if you truly swear to forsake violence, then you must understand that the world will test you. It will push you and prod you and do everything in its considerable power to make you break it. And when that day comes, and it will come, you'll have to decide whether your soul is worth more than your revenge." Elijah took those words to heart. He made his oath not to Jeremiah or to God or to any abstract principle, but to himself, to the memory of the boy he'd been before the war turned him into a killing machine. And he meant it with every fiber of his being. He changed his name, moved west to a territory where nobody knew him, and found work as a ranch hand, a carpenter, anything that would keep his hands busy and his mind away from the past. For 15 years, for a decade and a half, Elijah kept his oath, and it wasn't easy, because the West in those days was a violent place, a place where disputes were settled with lead more often than with words, and more than once. Elijah found himself in situations where a gun would have solved his problems immediately. There was the time in Abilene when a drunk cowboy, angry about losing at cards, pulled a knife on him, and instead of drawing the pistol he no longer carried, Elijah took the stabbing, took the blade between his ribs, and nearly died from it, all because he refused to defend himself with lethal force. There was the time in Dodge City when he witnessed a man beating a woman in an alley, and instead of shooting the bastard like the old Elijah would have done without hesitation, he waded in with his bare hands, took a bottle to the skull that left him unconscious for 2 Days, but he stopped the beating and he kept his oath. People thought he was a coward. They mocked him. They pushed him around, and Elijah endured it all because he absolutely knew, that the moment he picked up a gun again, the moment he let that old darkness back in, it would consume him entirely. He settled eventually in a small town called Redemption, and yes, he was aware of the irony of the name. A town of maybe 200 souls, nestled in a valley in what is now Colorado, far enough from the railroad and the cattle trails that trouble rarely found it, and for a blessed while, Elijah found something approximating peace. He worked at the local stable, took care of the horses, and the townsfolk, who knew him as quiet, reliable Eli, accepted him as one of their own. He even started courting a woman, a widow named Sarah, who ran the town's only boarding house. And for the first time since he was a boy, Elijah allowed himself to imagine a future that didn't involve blood and death and the cold weight of a gun in his hand. But the past, as they say, is never really past. It's just waiting in the shadows, biding its time, sharpening its knives and cleaning its guns. And Elijah's past came riding into Redemption on a hot August afternoon in 1879 in the form of 5 men. And if you're waiting for me to tell you that these men were strangers, random outlaws who just happened to target the town, then I'm sorry to disappoint you, because these men knew exactly who Elijah was, and they'd come specifically for him. Their leader was a man named Clayton Reeves, and Clayton had a long memory and an even longer list of grievances, because 15 years earlier, during one of those brutal guerrilla raids that Elijah had participated in, Clayton's brother had been killed, shot down by Elijah himself during an ambush, and Clayton, who'd spent the intervening years festering in his hatred, had finally tracked down the man responsible. Now you might be thinking that Clayton came for revenge. Pure and simple, a bullet for a bullet, a life for a life. But Clayton was smarter and crueler than that, because he understood that shooting Elijah would be too quick, too merciful, and what he wanted wasn't just Elijah's death, but his complete and utter destruction. His soul shattered into so many pieces that even death would seem like a kindness. Clayton and his men rode into town like they owned it, and in a way they did, because they had the guns and the willingness to use them. And the sheriff, an old man named Tucker, who was good with paperwork but had never actually faced down killers, was the first one to die, shot down in the street when he tried to tell them to move along. The sound of that gunshot brought people running, and Clayton, standing over the sheriff's body, announced in a voice loud enough to carry to every corner of town that he was looking for a man named Elijah Stone. And if the town didn't produce him within the hour, people were going to start dying, one every 10 minutes, starting with the youngest. Elijah, who heard this from inside the stable, felt every muscle in his body go rigid, felt that old, familiar coldness spreading through his veins like ice water. And for the first time in 15 years, he wanted, truly and desperately wanted, to pick up a gun and do what he did best. But he remembered his oath, remembered Jeremiah's words about the weight of promises, and he walked out into the street with his hands raised, surrendering himself to save the town. Clayton smiled when he saw Elijah, a smile that held no warmth, only anticipation, and he said, "I've been waiting a long time for this, Stone." And Elijah, standing there unarmed and vulnerable, said nothing, just met Clayton's eyes with a steady gaze that said he knew exactly what was coming and he was prepared to face it. But Clayton didn't shoot him, didn't even touch him. Instead, he ordered his men to round up the townspeople, to gather them in the town square. And when everyone was assembled, when Sarah was standing there with tears streaming down her face, and the children were crying and the men were looking at Elijah with a mixture of confusion and betrayal, Clayton explained to them all exactly who Elijah was, what he'd done during the war, how many men he'd killed, how much blood stained his hands. The revelation hit the town like a thunderclap, and Elijah watched as the faces of people he'd come to care about, people who'd accepted him and trusted him, transformed into masks of horror and disgust, and Sarah, sweet Sarah, who'd never known violence in her life, looked at him like he was a stranger, like he was a monster that had been wearing the face of the man she loved. Clayton let that sink in for a minute, let the silence stretch until it was almost unbearable. And then he said, "Now here's what's going to happen. I'm going to give Mr. Stone a choice. He can pick up a gun right here, right now, and face me in a fair fight, and if he wins, me and my boys will ride out of here and never come back. But if he refuses, if he sticks to whatever cowardly philosophy he's adopted to soothe his guilty conscience, then we're going to start executing people one at a time, and we're going to make him watch." Elijah's mind raced, calculating options, looking for a way out that didn't involve breaking his oath or watching innocent people die. But Clayton had planned this perfectly, had cut off every escape route, every possible alternative, and the terrible genius of it was that either choice would destroy Elijah completely. If he picked up the gun, he'd be betraying everything he'd built over 15 years, every moment of peace he'd fought for, every step he'd taken away from the monster he used to be. But if he refused, if he kept his oath while people died because of him, the weight of that guilt would crush him just as surely as a bullet to the brain. Clayton could see the agony in Elijah's eyes, savored it like a fine wine, and he gestured to one of his men, who grabbed a young boy from the crowd. Couldn't have been more than 10 years old, the son of the town's blacksmith, and he put a gun to the boy's head. "Tick-tock, Stone," Clayton said, and the boy was crying, shaking, looking at Elijah with eyes that begged for salvation. And Elijah felt something inside him start to crack, felt the dam he'd built so carefully begin to fracture under the pressure. He thought about Jeremiah, about the Quakers who'd saved him, about the oath he'd sworn, and he thought about all the people he'd killed, all the lives he'd ended, and he realized with a clarity that was almost painful that his oath had never really been about non-violence. It had been about selfishness, about saving his own soul at the expense of everyone around. Him, a truly righteous man, a truly peaceful man, would find a way to save the boy without violence, would negotiate, would sacrifice himself, would do anything except pick up a gun. But Elijah knew, had always known deep down, that he wasn't a righteous man. He was just a killer who'd been pretending to be something else. The crack in the dam became a fissure, and the fissure became a break. And when Elijah spoke, his voice was different, harder, colder, the voice of the man he used to be, and he said, "Let the boy go and I'll take your offer." Clayton's smile widened, and he gestured for his man to release the child, who ran sobbing to his mother. And then Clayton pulled a gun from his belt, an old Colt Navy revolver, and he tossed it to Elijah, who caught it without thinking, his hand remembering the weight, the balance, the feel of death incarnate. For 15 years, Elijah had refused to touch a gun, but the moment his fingers closed around that grip, it was like coming home to a house you swore you'd never enter again, and he felt everything he'd fought so hard to bury come rushing back, all the skills, all the instincts, all the cold, calculating murder that had made him one of the most feared guerrilla fighters of the war. Clayton and Elijah faced each other in the street, 20 paces apart, and the townspeople watched in silence, some hoping that Elijah would win, others hoping he'd die and take his violent past with him, but all of them understanding that they were about to witness something terrible and irrevocable. Clayton was fast. Everyone knew he was fast. He'd made a reputation in the years since the war as a gunfighter, had killed at least a dozen men in fair fights, and he was confident, arrogantly confident, that he would put a bullet in Elijah before the old guerrilla could even clear leather. But what Clayton didn't understand, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that Elijah Stone at his peak, Elijah Stone before the oath, wasn't just fast. He was supernatural, his draw so smooth and effortless that it looked like the gun simply appeared in his hand. And when Clayton went for his gun, when his hand moved with the speed that had won him a dozen duels, Elijah had already drawn and fired before Clayton's barrel, had even cleared the holster. The bullet took Clayton in the chest, dead center, punching through his heart and dropping him like a stone. And he had just enough time before he died to realize that he'd made a terrible, fatal mistake, that he'd awakened something that should have remained buried forever. But Elijah wasn't done, because Clayton's 4 men, seeing their leader fall, went for their guns, and Elijah, moving with a fluidity that seemed impossible for a man who hadn't held a gun in 15 years, fanned the hammer, putting 4 shots out in rapid succession, and all 4 men dropped before they could fire a single round, each shot placed with surgical precision. 1 through the throat, 1 through the eye, 2 through the heart, and the entire fight, from Clayton's hand moving to the last man falling, had taken less than 3 seconds. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of gun smoke drifting on the wind, and the bodies settling into the dust, and Elijah stood there, the gun still smoking in his hand, and he looked down at what he'd done with an expression that was neither satisfaction nor regret, just a kind of weary acceptance, like a man who'd known this moment was coming and had finally stopped running from it. He looked at Sarah, saw the fear and confusion and something else, something that might have been pity or might have been revulsion, and he knew that whatever they'd had, whatever future they might have built together, was gone as surely as if he'd shot it himself. He looked at the townspeople, at their faces filled with shock and awe and terror, and he knew that he couldn't stay here, that the man they'd known as quiet, peaceful Eli was dead, killed by his own hand, just as surely as the 5 men in the street. Elijah walked to where Clayton's body lay, bent down and retrieved the man's gun belt, strapped it on with movements that were automatic, muscle memory from a lifetime ago, and then he walked to the stable, saddled a horse, and rode out of Redemption without saying a word to anyone, without looking back, because there was nothing left to say and nothing left to look at except the ruins of 15 years of trying to be someone he wasn't. Now, if this were a different kind of story, this is where it would end, with the gunslinger riding off into the sunset, having saved the town but lost his soul in the process. A tragic figure condemned to wander the earth with the weight of his broken oath, but this is the Wild West. My friends, and out here stories don't end cleanly. They just spiral down into darker and darker places until there's nothing left but blood and dust. What happened next is where this tale earns its place in the annals of Western legend, because Elijah, having broken his oath, having let the demon back in, didn't just become a gunfighter again. He became something worse, something so ruthless and so efficient that even the hardest men in the territories spoke his name in whispers. He started hunting, actively seeking out the worst of the worst, the killers and the rapists and the men who preyed on the weak, and he didn't arrest them, didn't try to bring them to justice. He simply executed them with a cold efficiency that was terrifying in its precision. Within 6 months, 23 wanted men had died by Elijah's hand, and the manner of their deaths sent a message that was impossible to ignore. The silent had returned, and he was judge, jury, and executioner all rolled into one. But here's the thing that made Elijah different from other vigilantes, from other men who'd appointed themselves as the instruments of justice. He didn't enjoy it, didn't take satisfaction from the killing. He did it with the same mechanical precision that a man might use to chop wood or shoe a horse, necessary work that needed doing, and when each man fell, Elijah felt nothing, no triumph, no relief, just a deepening emptiness that grew with every body he left in his wake. He was haunted, truly and deeply haunted, not by the men he killed, because those men had earned their deaths 1,000 times over, but by the realization that Jeremiah had been right, that the oath had been the only thing keeping him human, and without it he was just a tool, a weapon pointed at evil, but still just a weapon, incapable of redemption or salvation or anything resembling peace. The law tried to stop him, Marshals and sheriffs and bounty hunters all came after the man they called the Silent, but Elijah was a ghost, appearing only to kill and then vanishing back into the wilderness. And the few lawmen who managed to corner him found themselves facing a choice: walk away and let him continue his crusade, or draw and die, because Elijah had a rule now, a simple one that he never broke. He only killed men who drew on him first, which meant that every death could be classified as self-defense, legally if not morally. For 3 years, Elijah carved a bloody path through the territories, and his legend grew with every kill. Stories spreading about the silent gunfighter who never missed, who never hesitated, who moved like death incarnate. And young men who fancied themselves fast with a gun started seeking him out, wanting to be the one who finally put down the Silent, wanting to earn the reputation that came with killing a legend. They all died, every last one of them, because Elijah was beyond fast. He was precognitive, reading intentions in the twitch of an eye or the shift of weight, knowing when a man was going to draw before the man himself knew, and he put them down with shots so precise that sometimes, when the bodies were examined, lawmen would find that the bullet had passed through exactly the same hole as a previous wound, which should have been impossible but somehow wasn't when the Silent was pulling the trigger. But the story doesn't end with Elijah as some kind of avenging angel. Doesn't end with him riding off having cleaned up the West, because that's not how these things work. That's not what happens when a man breaks the one promise that was keeping him sane. The end came in a town called Pedition, another one of those ironically named places that the West was full of, and Elijah was there tracking a man named Jacob Mercer, a serial killer who'd murdered at least 15 women across 3 states, and Mercer had holed up in a saloon with hostages, 3 women who worked there, and when Elijah walked in, Mercer recognized him immediately, because everyone knew what the Silent looked like by then. And Mercer, who was crazy but not stupid, made Elijah an offer: "You let me walk out of here, and I let these women live. You try to stop me, and I start cutting throats." Elijah stood there in the doorway, the afternoon sun behind him casting his shadow long across the saloon floor, and he considered the situation with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through 100 gunfights. He could let Mercer go, save the women, and hunt the man down later, which would be the tactical choice, the smart choice. But Elijah knew, absolutely knew, that Mercer would kill again before he could be caught, would take more lives to satisfy whatever twisted hunger drove him and the women, these 3 terrified women who'd done nothing except have the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their eyes were begging him to do something, anything, to end this nightmare. Elijah made his choice, and it was the choice that the old guerrilla fighter would have made, the choice that valued completing the mission over minimizing casualties. And he drew with a speed that was almost casual, putting a bullet through Mercer's gun hand before the man could even react, and Mercer, screaming, dropped his knife and tried to reach for his gun with his other hand, and Elijah shot him again, through the shoulder this time, spinning him around and away from the hostages. The women ran, scrambling for the door, and Mercer, bleeding and desperate, managed to pull his gun with his offhand, managing, despite everything, to get off a shot that went wild, shattering a mirror behind the bar, and Elijah, standing perfectly still, aimed and fired one last time, the bullet taking Mercer through the forehead and snapping his head back, and the killer fell backwards onto a card table that collapsed under his weight. It should have been over, another evil man dead, another threat eliminated, but one of Mercer's wild shots, the ones he'd fired before Elijah had entered the saloon, had ricocheted off something metal, probably a spittoon or a belt buckle, and that ricocheted bullet, traveling at an angle that defied probability, had struck one of the women in the back as she ran for the door, and she collapsed halfway to safety, blood spreading across her dress. Elijah was at her side in an instant, turning her over gently, seeing the wound and knowing immediately that it was fatal. The bullet had clipped her lung, and she was drowning in her own blood. And she looked up at him with eyes that held no accusation, just confusion and fear. And she tried to say something but could only cough, blood flecking her lips, and Elijah held her as she died, feeling her body go still in his arms, and something inside him, some last tiny fragment of humanity that had survived the breaking of the oath and 3 years of killing, finally shattered completely. He laid her down gently, closed her eyes with trembling fingers, and stood up, looking at his hands, at the blood that stained them, literal and metaphorical, and he understood with absolute clarity what he'd become. Not a force for justice, not an avenging angel, just another killer, another instrument of death. And the fact that his intentions had been good meant nothing to the woman lying dead on the saloon floor. Elijah walked out of that saloon, walked to his horse, and rode out of Pedition, but this time he didn't ride toward another target, another mission, another man who needed killing. He rode toward the only place that made sense, the only place where there might be any chance of redemption, or at least understanding. He rode back to the Quaker settlement where Jeremiah had saved him all those years ago, and he arrived 3 weeks later, half-starved and hollow-eyed, and he found Jeremiah sitting on the porch of the same house, older now, his beard white instead of gray, but still with those eyes that saw too much. Elijah dismounted, walked up to the porch, and the first words he'd spoken to anyone in months came out. "And as a confession, you were right. I broke my oath and it destroyed me." Jeremiah looked at him for a long moment, then gestured to the chair beside him, and Elijah sat. And the old Quaker said, "Tell me everything," and Elijah did. He told him about Clayton and redemption and the 3 years of killing and the woman in Pedition, and he spoke for hours, letting it all pour out like poison from a wound. And when he was finished, when he'd confessed every detail of every death, he looked at Jeremiah and asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he'd broken his oath. Can I ever be forgiven? Can I ever be anything other than what I am? Jeremiah was quiet for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute truth. Forgiveness isn't something you receive, son. It's something you earn through action day by day, choice by choice. And the fact that you broke your oath doesn't mean you can't make a new one, but this time make it with your eyes open, understanding that keeping it will be harder than breaking. It ever was. Elijah stayed with the Quakers for 3 months, helping with their farm, their chores, living simply and quietly, and during that time, he made a new oath, not to never use a gun, because that oath had proven impossible to keep when evil men threatened innocence, but to never draw first, to never kill except in immediate defense of innocent life, and to spend whatever years he had left trying to balance the scales, trying to save more lives than he'd taken. He rode out of the settlement with Jeremiah's blessing and a new purpose, and what happened in the years that followed is another story entirely. But the legend says that the silent became something different, not a vigilante or a killer, but a protector, a man who appeared when trouble came to small towns and weak people, who faced down the predators of the West with a gun that rarely needed to be fired, because his reputation alone was often enough to make bad men reconsider their choices. The story of Elijah Stone teaches us something fundamental about the nature of oaths and redemption and the violence that lives inside every human heart. It teaches us that sometimes the line between right and wrong isn't as clear as we want it to be, that sometimes keeping a promise means watching innocence die, and breaking it means losing a part of yourself that can never be recovered, and maybe, just maybe, the real test of a man's character isn't whether he keeps his oaths, but what he does after he breaks them, how he chooses to move forward when the easy path would be to just give up and embrace the monster he fears he's become. Elijah lived for another 20 years after Pedition, And in those years, he saved hundreds of lives. He stopped robberies and prevented murders and faced down outlaws who preyed on the weak. And he did it all without ever forgetting what he'd done, carrying the weight of his broken oath and his dead-like stones in his pockets, heavy and constant and impossible to set down. He died in 1902 in a small town in New Mexico, taking a bullet meant for a child, throwing himself in front of the shot without hesitation. And his last words, spoken to the doctor who tried to save him, were, "Did the kid make it?" And when the doctor nodded, Elijah smiled, just a little, and closed his eyes for the last time. They buried him in the town cemetery, under a simple stone that read, Elijah Stone, 1847-1902. He tried, and if you go there today, if you find that grave, you'll see that people still leave flowers, still remember the silent, not as a killer or a vigilante, but as a man who broke his oath and spent the rest of his life trying to make amends. A man who understood that redemption isn't about being perfect. It's about continuing to try even when you know you'll never succeed. Now, before we wrap this up, I want you to think about something. Think about the oaths you've made in your own life, the promises you've sworn to keep, and ask yourself honestly whether you're keeping them because they're right or because they're comfortable, because they protect you from having to make hard choices. Elijah's story is a reminder that sometimes the right thing to do means breaking your most sacred promises, and sometimes keeping them means condemning others to suffer. And the only way to navigate that impossible maze is to constantly examine your motivations, your choices, your understanding of what it means to be good in a world that often demands you be otherwise. The Wild West was a crucible, a place where men were tested and found wanting or found strong. And Elijah Stone was tested harder than most. And while he failed his first test, failed it spectacularly and completely, he spent the rest of his life taking the test over and over, again, until he finally passed, not by being perfect, but by never stopping trying. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about your own oaths and your own breaking points, then I want you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button, because I bring you stories like this every week. Tales from the Wild West that go beyond the simple good versus evil narratives and dig into the complicated, messy reality of what it meant to live and die in those times. Drop a comment below telling me what you would have done in Elijah's position. Would you have kept the oath and let the boy die? Or would you have broken it and lived with the consequences? There's no wrong answer, and I want to hear your thoughts. I want to start a conversation about the nature of promises and violence and redemption. And if you like this video, if this story grabbed you and held you from beginning to end, smash that like button, because it tells the algorithm to share this with more people. And these stories, these lessons from history, they deserve to be heard by as many folks as possible. The West was won and lost by men like Elijah Stone, men who carried guns and guilt in equal measure, who tried to be good in a land that often rewarded evil, and their stories, while brutal and often tragic, contain truths that are still relevant today, still applicable to our modern lives, where the choices might be different, but the fundamental questions about right and wrong, about keeping promises and breaking them, about becoming monsters or remaining human, those questions remain exactly the same. Elijah's greatest lesson wasn't about fast draws or accuracy, or any of the technical aspects of gunfighting. It was about the fact that you can't run from what you are. You can only choose what you do with it, and sometimes redemption looks like picking up the very thing you swore to abandon, not because you want to, but because lives depend on it. And the measure of a man isn't found in his ability to avoid violence, but in his willingness to use it only when all other options have been exhausted and innocent blood is about to be spilled. The years following Elijah's transformation were marked by a pattern that became almost predictable to those who studied his movements, and yes, there were people who studied him, lawmen and historians and newspaper writers who tracked his exploits with a mixture of fascination and horror, because the silent had become something unique in the annals of Western history, not quite an outlaw, but certainly not a lawman, existing in that grey space between legal authority and vigilante justice that made both sides uncomfortable. He would appear in a town, always arriving quietly, never announcing himself, never seeking attention or glory, and he would stay just long enough to identify the threat, whatever form it took. Whether it was a gang planning a bank robbery or a land baron terrorizing homesteaders or a corrupt sheriff, extorting the citizens he was supposed to protect. And then he would act swift and decisive. And when the dust settled and the bodies were counted, Elijah would be gone, riding out before anyone could properly thank him or arrest him or even ask him why. There were dozens of these incidents, maybe hundreds, if you count the smaller interventions that never made it into the papers, the quiet words that prevented violence, the confrontations that ended without shots fired because Elijah's reputation preceded him and smart men knew better than to draw on the silent. But there were also spectacular confrontations, moments that became legendary even in a time when legends were born and died with the setting sun. And I want to tell you about a few of them, because they illustrate perfectly what Elijah had become in those years after breaking his oath, a man who had accepted his nature as a weapon, but insisted on being a weapon wielded with precision and purpose rather than rage and revenge. In the spring of 1883, there was trouble in a mining town called Silver Creek, situated high in the Rocky Mountains, where the air was thin and the law was thinner, and the trouble came in the form of a man named Marcus Thorne, a mine owner who decided that labor laws and safety regulations were obstacles to profit rather than protections for workers. Thorne ran his mines with brutal efficiency, paying his workers barely enough to survive, forcing them to work in conditions that regularly resulted in cave-ins and deaths. And when the miners tried to organize, tried to demand better treatment, Thorne hired a gang of enforcers to break heads and burn homes, making it clear that dissent would be met with violence. The territorial governor was either bought off or too scared to intervene. The local law was in Thorne's pocket, and the miners, most of them immigrants with no money and nowhere else to go, were trapped, unable to leave and unable to fight back without risking their families. Word of the situation reached Elijah through channels that he'd developed over the years, a network of contacts that stretched across the territories. Good people who knew that if they sent word to certain places, left certain messages, the silent would come. And so he did, riding into Silver Creek on a cold morning when frost still clung to the ground and his breath came out in white clouds. He took a room at a boarding house run by a widow whose husband had died in one of Thorne's mines, and he spent 3 days just watching, observing the patterns, understanding the situation, because Elijah had learned long ago that rushing in with guns blazing was the surest way to make things worse, and he'd made too many mistakes already to add carelessness to the list. He saw the enforcers, 8 of them, all hard men with guns and no conscience, and he saw how they moved through town like they owned it, which they did in every way that mattered, taking what they wanted, threatening anyone who looked at them wrong. And he saw the miners, broken men with defeated eyes, and he saw the women and children who depended on those defeated men, and he made his decision. Elijah didn't confront Thorne directly, didn't walk into his office and demand justice, because men like Thorne didn't understand justice. They understood only power, and the only language that would penetrate their greed-soaked brains was violence, swift and uncompromising. Instead, Elijah waited until evening, when Thorne's enforcers gathered at the town's only saloon, drinking and playing cards, and generally making everyone else miserable with their presence. And he walked in through the front door, his duster sweeping the floor, his hat pulled low, and every conversation in that saloon died the moment they saw him, because even though most of them didn't know who he was, they recognized the walk, the bearing, the cold certainty of a man who had come to kill. The lead enforcer, a brute named Caleb who'd earned his reputation breaking men's bones with his bare hands, stood up from his card game and said, "We don't want trouble here, friend. So why don't you turn around and walk back out that door?" And Elijah, stopping in the center of the room, said just 5 words, the first words he'd spoken since entering town: "Marcus, Thorn's reign is over." The silence that followed was absolute, and then Caleb laughed, a booming sound that held genuine amusement, and he said, "You hear that, boys? This saddle tramp thinks he's going to take down Thorn." And the other enforcers laughed too, but their laughter was nervous, uncertain, because there was something in Elijah's eyes, something cold and final, that suggested this wasn't going to end the way they expected. Caleb, still confident, walked toward Elijah with his fists raised, intending to beat this fool into submission the way he'd beaten so many others, but Elijah didn't move, didn't react, just stood there watching Caleb approach. And when the big man was close enough, when he'd committed to his attack, Elijah moved with a speed that seemed impossible, his hand coming up and striking Caleb's throat with 2 extended fingers. A precise blow that crushed the windpipe and sent Caleb stumbling backwards, gasping for air that wouldn't come, dying on his feet. The other enforcers went for their guns, all 7 of them drawing at once, and Elijah's hand moved to his Colt, the motion so smooth it looked rehearsed, and he fired 6 times in rapid succession, each shot finding its target, each bullet placed with surgical precision, through hearts and heads and throats, and 6 men fell. And the 7th, the youngest of them, a boy who couldn't have been more than 19, froze with his gun half drawn, staring at Elijah with eyes wide with terror, and Elijah, his gun still smoking, said, "Drop it and walk away, son. This doesn't have to be your fight." And the boy, shaking, dropped his gun and ran, fleeing out the back door and into the night. And Elijah let him go, because he'd learned that mercy, real mercy, wasn't about never killing. It was about only killing when there was no other choice. The next morning, Elijah walked into Marcus Thorn's office, past the secretary who tried to stop him, past the guards who took one look at his face and decided they weren't paid enough to interfere. And he found Thorn sitting behind his massive desk, counting money, literally counting stacks of bills like some caricature of a robber baron from a dime novel. Thorn looked up when Elijah entered, his face registering first confusion, then recognition, because even isolated in his mountain kingdom, Thorn had heard of the silent, and he said, his voice trying for bravado but not quite achieving it, "I don't know what you've heard, but everything I do here is perfectly legal." And Elijah, standing in front of the desk, said, "Your enforcers are dead, all but one who I let run, and you have a choice now. A simple one that even a man of your limited moral capacity should be able to understand." Elijah laid it out clearly, clinically, without emotion or threat, just statements of fact. Thorn would sell his mines to a company that operated legally and treated workers fairly. He would compensate the families of every man who died in his mines, paying them enough to start over somewhere else if they wanted, and he would leave Colorado Territory within a week, never to return. And if he complied with these terms, he would live. But if he refused, if he tried to hire more guns or use his influence to wriggle out of accountability, Elijah would come back. And next time, there would be no conversation, no offer. Just a bullet and an unmarked grave somewhere in the mountains where even the wolves wouldn't find him. Thorn, seeing death sitting across from him wearing a dusty duster and carrying a Colt that had never missed, agreed to every term, his hands shaking as he signed the papers that Elijah had prepared, documents that would be witnessed and filed with the territorial government, ensuring that there would be legal recourse if Thorn tried to back out. Within a month, the mines had new ownership. The working conditions improved dramatically, and the families of the dead received compensation that, while it couldn't bring back their loved ones, at least gave them options, gave them hope. And Elijah, watching from a distance to make sure Thorne kept his word, finally rode out of Silver Creek, leaving behind a town transformed, not through law or politics or peaceful negotiation, but through the threat of violence wielded by a man who understood that sometimes evil only responds to the language of force. This incident, like so many others in Elijah's later years, illustrated the fundamental paradox of his existence. He had become a force for good through methods that were undeniably violent, saving lives by being willing to take them, protecting the innocent by being more dangerous than the predators who hunted them. But the cost, the personal cost to Elijah, was enormous and growing with each passing year, because every shot he fired, every life he ended, even when it was justified, even when it saved others, added to the weight he carried, and there were nights, many nights, when he would wake up screaming, haunted by the faces of all the men he'd killed, both during the war and after, and he would sit by whatever campfire he'd built and wonder if he was really any different from the men he hunted, if the line between justice and murder was as clear as he wanted to believe, or if he was just another killer with a better story. He wrote letters during those long nights, letters he never sent, addressed to Sarah, the woman he'd lost in redemption, trying to explain, trying to justify, trying to make sense of what he'd become. And in those letters, we see a man grappling with questions that had no easy answers. Questions about the nature of violence and righteousness, and whether a man could do evil things for good reasons and still claim to be good himself. One letter, dated 1885 and found among his possessions after his death, reads in part, "I have saved perhaps 300 lives in the years since I broke my oath, but I have taken 47, and I count them every night before I sleep. Memorize their faces, speak their names if I know them, because I owe them that much at least. I owe them the acknowledgement that they were human beings, not just obstacles to be removed, and I wonder, Sarah, I wonder if the scales will ever balance. If I save 1,000, will it erase the 47? Or will those faces haunt me into whatever comes after this life? And honestly, I hope they do, because a man who can kill without being haunted is a man who has lost his humanity entirely, and that, more than anything, is what I fear becoming." The incident that perhaps best exemplifies both Elijah's effectiveness and his internal struggle came in 1888, in a town called Grafton, where a gang of outlaws led by a charismatic psychopath named Thomas Creed had taken control, not through the usual methods of intimidation and violence, though there was plenty of that, but through a more insidious approach. They had ingratiated themselves with the townspeople, presented themselves as protectors against other threats, and slowly, methodically, turned the town into their personal kingdom, with Creed ruling like some feudal lord and the citizens, unable to see that they'd traded freedom for the illusion of safety. By the time anyone realized what had happened, Creed's gang controlled the bank, the telegraph office, the general store, every point of access and commerce, and anyone who objected found themselves ostracized. Their businesses boycotted, their families threatened, and gradually opposition died out, replaced by a sullen acceptance that this was just how things were now. Elijah arrived in Grafton posing as a drifter looking for work, and he spent 2 weeks embedded in the town, working odd jobs, listening, observing, and what he discovered troubled him more than the usual situations he found himself in, because the people of Grafton weren't being held hostage in the traditional sense. They had, through a combination of fear and manipulation, become complicit in their own oppression, and simply killing Creed and his gang wouldn't solve the problem. It would just create a power vacuum that another opportunist would fill, and the cycle would begin again. So Elijah did something he rarely did. He revealed himself, not to Creed, but to a small group of townspeople who he'd identified as the core of potential resistance, people who still had that spark of independence, that refusal to completely submit, and he gathered them in the basement of the church and told them who he was and why he'd come. The reaction was mixed. Some were hopeful, seeing in Elijah a savior who would free them. Others were skeptical, pointing out that Creed had 20 men, all armed and loyal. And even the silent couldn't take on those odds. And one man, a shopkeeper named Hutchins, who'd lost his son to Creed's gang when the boy had dared to speak out, said what everyone was thinking. Even if you kill Creed, even if you somehow kill all his men, what's to stop the next gang from doing the same thing? We need to be able to defend ourselves, to stand up. But we've forgotten how. We've become sheep. And sheep don't suddenly become wolves just because the shepherd dies. Elijah looked at Hutchins, saw in him the same defeated resignation he'd seen in so many towns, and he said something that surprised everyone in that basement, including himself. Then I'll teach you to be wolves.